In 1902, Vaughan Williams wrote, "There is no doubt that folk songs are hardly sung at all by the people nowadays." The following year, he wrote, "Last spring I spent a fortnight in a village not 20 miles from London, and there and in the neighbourhood I noted down over 50 genuine folk songs. In all, he collected 107 songs from 22 singers between December 1903 and October 1904, and another 9 from Mr. Bell in Ingrave in 1906. So I'd like to start by taking a look at the context of folk song in Ingrave, both geographical and social, and the context of Vaughan Williams' encounters with folk song in Essex. So if we look at the next screen, which is a not really very good map there. I hope it might be an idea if I just, no, I can't, it's too far away. If you look at the railway line, look, let's right. Always people see now. Here's Brentwood and the railway line. So you come out of London to Brentwood. The railway line was built in the 1890s. So it's quite a recent thing. And so there's the station. A couple of hundred yards north of the station is where he went to give the lectures. And this is Ingrave, just a little 2.5 miles down the road. Now, the youngest daughters of the rector of Ingrave attended these classes in Brentwood. A little bit further down the road, another couple of miles, is Herringate. Another couple of miles is East Horndon. So you can see how close these places are together. Then, if we go a little bit around the road to here, we get to Great Erstead, where he collected songs from William Harris, the farmer. One of the songs he collected was All Around My Hat, which I think became quite popular at one point. And a little bit further up here is Bibberickie, where he went to the workhouse and collected songs from John Denny. The other place I'd like to mention is South Weald, a little bit north of Brentwood here, South Weald, where my children went to school, in fact. It was the birthplace of Charles Potter. And the sort of outlier is Willingdale, which is up here. You'd have to carry on to Chelmsford. I'm not quite sure what route you would have taken. Couldn't want to read it, so up there. Anyway, we'll come into some detail about it. But it's the geographical proximity that I think we need to bear in mind. These people knew each other, and it was also possible to get to them. Stand back to the seat. Okay. So that's the village of Ingrave. So he'd begun a course of lectures on the history of folk song for the Oxford University Extension programme. So yes, among those were the attending with the Heatley sisters. So I think, I've covered all that. There we go. The village of Willingdale that he went to he went there to meet Mrs. Charles White, who was a sister of Alice Horsnell, who lived in Ingrave. So that was the connection. And so the next screen. Now, while he's giving these talks, and he said that he doesn't think that folk song is sung anymore, Georgina Heatley started passing notes to him, and this was the first of those, 13th of March 1903. She's passed him this note, giving 3 verses of the Golden Glove, which she says she's taken down from an old lady who sings this song. In fact, it was Mrs. Humphreys. And I think one of the things that we need to notice all the time is how long it took to write down the words of a song. She's got 3 verses from Mrs. Humphreys. Mrs. Humphreys was quite happy to have the Heatley sisters visit her regularly. She was happy to sing the song again, and they took the words down longhand. Unless you do shorthand, like Maud Carpeley's, you're not going to get very many words down in one go. So the next screen. So she's also sent him an incomplete set of words of "Come buy me a hawk and a hound." And notice also that that Georgina Heatley is now asking the singer, she's asking Mrs. Humphreys where she got the song from. And I think this may have been prompted by something that Vaughan Williams would have said in the lectures to find out where the songs came from. And in that instance, I think she said, I can't read it from here, but Mrs. Humphreys got her songs from her father and her grandfather. In April, she sent him a note with a list of songs sung by Emma Turner, who was the maid at the rectory. Emma Turner was 19. So we've got Mrs. Humphreys, who was 69, and we've got Emma Turner, who was 19. It wasn't just the oldest people in the community who were singing these songs at that point. In the list, there's Mrs. Turner, Alice Horsnell, and some children. And the note goes on, and I hear that at Navestock, which is 6 miles from Ingrave, all the cottage people meet and sing to each other. Also at Munden in the marsh country beyond Malden, there is any quantity of singing of old songs at the public houses by men, and the boys pick them up and go on with them. And I'm told one of these is a song of 24 verses. And I think the idea that the songs were being sung by groups of people in the pubs indicates that it was still a living tradition. It wasn't just something that a few old people remembered from their childhood. It was still going on. But of course, the Heatley sisters couldn't go into the pubs. They could go and visit Mrs. Humphreys and take songs down from her. They could question the maid, but they couldn't go into the pubs and take songs down from the workmen. So this was the information that they got and passed on to Vaughan Williams. So if we go on to that, yeah. So this is the Ingrave Rectory. Not as it was then, because it was remodelled in 1911, but this is where he eventually came to tea and where he was introduced to Charles Potiphar, among others. He was giving these classes between January and April, but he didn't go to tea at the rectory until December. A chap called Frank Deneen did some research on this, and it would appear that Vaughan Williams came to give a talk at Brentwood School about I don't know about if it was about folk song or about song in general in December. And Georgina Heatley's older brothers were old boys of Brentwood School. She may have gone to the talk herself, but he then came to tea after that and was introduced to Charles Potiphar, among other people. So if we go on to the next one. So before we leave Georgina Heatley and her notes for the time being, let's just notice that she was giving him the names of local singers and lists of the songs that they sang. So she was already lining this up, organising what was going to happen. And see, for example, that the first song, which she calls Bethlehem City, is then corrected to Jesse's City. I'm not sure the handwriting, the pencil correction, whether that's hers or his. It's not a handwriting expert, and I can't really tell. And Emma Turner was a live-in maid, so she was very handy. I mentioned the geographical closeness. So Emma Turner lives in the rectory. Potiphar's cottage is very close to the rectory, and as you walk down, I think it used to be called Kissingate Alley. It's not the road, but the path down from the rectory down to the main road. You go past Potiphar's cottage, and then you go down a little bit further. You come to Common Low Road, where Mrs. Humphreys lived. So these people were all within hailing distance of each other. The song Jessie City is. I'll go into that a little bit later then. So that the next one, right. What we've got here is Vaughan Williams' notes where he took down the tune of Jessie City. And I think this illustrates the difficulty of people without a great deal of musical background or knowledge actually making very much sense of this. There's nothing incorrect, but it's not very easy to read if you're not good at reading music. But he's taken down the tune, and I think that this is something that Georgina Heatley was really, this was her ambition, because he could write down the tunes, but she couldn't. And so we can see, we start to see what's involved even in writing down the tunes. On the first day of collecting, where he met Charles Potiphar, Emma Turner, Mrs. Horsnell, a couple of other people and some children, he took down 20 tunes from 6 singers in one day. She'd done a lot of, Georgina Heatley had done a lot of work setting this up, but his skill was central to this. This wasn't a skill that a lot of people had. But I think we can see why he didn't write down the words. You know, there's 20 songs, you're not going to manage that. Especially as most of the songs existed in other variants, and he had other collections, and he had broadsides to refer to. So we go to the next screen. Famously, the first song he took down in Essex was Bushes and Briars from Charles Potiphar. And he said, "An old man began to sing, which put all my thoughts about folk song at rest." This is the entry in the births register at the church in South Weald. And you notice how the name is spelt. If we look at the next screen, it's quite hard to make out, I'm afraid. This is his parents' grave in the churchyard in Ingrave, and it's spelt P-H-E-R, not P-H-A-R, and Vaughan Williams himself spelt it with a double F. Other sources, especially when people have done the family tree, find that the name is spelt differently. So I think it's a matter of take your choice, really. But it's an odd name, and I mention that because the group I'm in, we call ourselves Potiphar's Apprentices, and we spell it A-R, and but generally it's spelled E-R. Charles Potiphar was a general labourer, and he moved away from South Weald and went to live in Little Worley, where he worked on building the railway. And this is the railway that brought Vaughan Williams to Brentwood. And the land for the railway was bought from Colonel Lowndes, who was a big landowner, and he also owned land in Ingrave, so that might be how Potiphar ended up in Ingrave. The next one. Yes, these are, Vaughan Williams didn't just write down the tunes, but he would often make little notes about what people said. He tried to get Potiphar to talk about where he thought the songs came from. And one of the things that Potiphar said was that if there was ever a murder or anything, somebody would be sure to write a ballad on it. And that there are plenty of murder ballads, but it makes me think particularly of the one that Vaughan Williams collected from Mr. Bell in Ingrave in 1906, called Murder of Mount Nessing. There's only one verse. It's one of these things that I think Caroline was referring to, where you get what's almost a template of a folk song. And so it starts off with a kind of standard thing about, there's this terrible story about this terrible murder. But we've been able to track down the actual murder that it's referring to, because there weren't that many murders in Mount Nessing. It's a very, very small place. Next screen then, yeah. Okay, so that's Ingrave Rectory. I thought, I could have shown you a boring photograph of Ingrave Church, thank you. But I thought I'd show you a drawing I did of it, with bushes and briars in front of it. That's right. Okay, and it's the church was actually built by Lord Peter, that comes from a Catholic family, and I thought it was strange that he'd built an Anglican church, but according to Lord Peter, that was because they demolished the original church in order to develop a nice parkland view for the house, so he had to build another church slightly down the road. Now, as we know, Vaughan Williams had been appointed musical director of the New English Hymnal, which was published in 1906. And he used 3 tunes from Essex in the hymnal, 2 of which he collected on that first day, December the 4th, 1903. So the next, yeah. And so the first of these is a tune he calls Ingrave, and it's the tune of the Sheffield Apprentice sung by Charles Potiphar. Vaughan Williams commented, "It's impossible to convey the subtle portamento of this beautiful tune in ordinary notation." And, he might have cleaned up the tune a little bit for the hymnal, but in his notes, he always gives as accurate a representation as possible of what was actually being sung. And he also, the point is, the story about the Sheffield Apprentice is about jealousy, it's about entrapment, and it's about somebody being hanged. But the hymn is words by Percy Dearmer, and it's about little children coming under Jesus. The contrast is absolutely mind-boggling, and you can understand why. He didn't write the Sheffield Apprentice; he just wrote Ingrave. Otherwise, as he said, people might have been upset about that. He also used the tune of Jesse's City and called it Herringate, and later he used the tune of the Fisherman, which he collected in the Old Dog, the pub, and called it East Horndon. He said, "It's the job of the folk song collector to give back the songs to the mouths of the people." And people of my generation grew up singing hymns from versions of the New English Hymnal. So at least for us, there was some familiarity with these tunes. And the next screen, yeah. So this is the last of Georgina Heatley's notes that I'm going to show you. In this one, there are more lists of singers, but also detailed instructions of how to find them. And you can see at the bottom that she mentions Mr. Bloomfield in Dunton Road, who was a woodcutter and lived in Keeper's Cottage. And when you drive down Dunton Road, you can still see the sign for Keeper's Cottage. And the next screen. I mentioned that the Heatley sisters couldn't go into the pubs. This house was formerly the Cricketers Inn, where Mr. Bloomfield sang. Vaughan Williams describes him as a big man with a long reach who'd been known to go on for hours when well primed. He sang in the old way with his eyes closed and repeating the last line of the song. And the next one is, now that's the sort of thing that you're likely to come across if you look at the original notes. It's a version of A Nutting We Will Go, and interestingly, it's much the same as the version collected by Fred Hamer from Harry Green. And the next one is, this is the Bell at Willingale, no longer a pub, and this is where Vaughan Williams met Mrs. Charles White, who was a sister of Alice Horsnell, and at least two other, and Samuel Childs, and at least two other unnamed singers. It was unusual for him not to note the singers' names, but one of the songs was about poaching, and it may be that the singer didn't want to give his name. And on that occasion, he collected 4 different versions of The Banks of the Sweet Primroses. And I think we can all imagine the situation where, with the singers arguing and saying, no, it doesn't, it goes like this. The Bell is now a private house, but an old chap in the village described it as the sort of pub where you could get a pint of beer and your teeth smashed in for 4p. And the next one is Samuel Childs, who sang for Vaughan Williams. He sang a version of Sweet Primroses. He was a horseman and a churchwarden. He was about 40 years old in 1903, and 20 years ago it was still possible to make out the wooden cross marking his grave. And the next, the Old Dog in East Horndon is still a pub. It serves very decent beer. It was and still is very small, and we fancy we know where Vaughan Williams sat on a couple of occasions buying beer and taking down songs. Mr. Kemp, Mr. Punt and Mr. Peacock lived in cottages since demolished next to the pub. And the next screen. Among the songs he noted at the Old Dog was The Cobbler, and unusually for him, he wrote out all the words. He published the tune and the first verse in his folk song journal, saying that the rest of the words are too vulgar for publication, although he obviously enjoyed them himself. I might say we tried to interest the licensees of the Old Dog in their connection with Vaughan Williams, and we even gave them a poster which used the illustration from our CD, Life in the Old Dog. But while they were polite, they had absolutely no interest in the connection, and I don't think they had any idea who Vaughan Williams was. Next one. So this is, again, a note from Georgina Heatley, a list of songs sung by Mrs. Humphreys. And it's interesting that when he did get to see her, he didn't collect any of these songs, but he took down 8 other songs from her, including The Golden Gov, The Saucy Sailor, Tarry Trousers, and The Cambric Shirt. Mrs. Humphreys seems to have liked songs about flirting and combative courtship. There was a theme in them. And the next one. So these are the words of The Cambric Shirt, which were written out by Florence Heatley, whose handwriting was very similar to her sister's. Now, Dave Ockemore and Coleman did the research in the late 70s, which they produced in 1980, where they collected all the songs that Vaughan Williams collected in Essex. So that's 116 of them, I think. But it's a limited publication, and there is a copy in the Essex Record Office. And now Dave Ockemore made a photocopy of this when he was researching Vaughan Williams in Essex. But when he went back later, it was missing. Now, I don't know if it's been found, but if not, it might be that the only copy of that is the photocopy in the Essex Record Office. And later that day, after he'd seen Mrs. Humphreys, he went to Billericay Workhouse, which was a new building, a fairly new building then, and he took down songs from Mr. John Denny, who was described as a roadman from Nevenden. He took down a tune for Lord Bateman, which is not the usual tune, and he also collected A Bold Young Farmer, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs in the English language, but it's also a typical modal died for love song, which was beloved of Vaughan Williams. It's a classic maiden's lament, except, of course, that she's no longer a maiden, which is the cause of the lament. And he wrote a piano accompaniment for this beautiful modal tune. And the piano accompaniment might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I think it shows his deep understanding of the structure of this and other tunes. And, you know, whether people like those arrangements or not is beside the point. It's the folk police don't own these tunes. They're a resource for everybody. So there he is. What a charmer. Yeah. So the mouths of the people, did they get returned to the mouths of the people? Well, there are hymn tunes and there are school songbooks. 9 of the Essex tunes went into the Folk Song Journal, and of course there are the orchestral works. There are arrangements he wrote for local choirs and for individuals on pianos, and the school songbooks, and the what we used to call the English Book of Penguin Folk Songs. No, okay. I must stop joking. But in 1907, he wrote to Sharp, "If the folk song has nothing to say to us as we are now, without a sham return to an imaginary, probably quite illusory Arcadia of several centuries ago, then I would burn all the collections I could lay my hands on and their singers with them." I'm done.